We have Dr. Pamela Ruiter-Feenstra. She is an accomplished and acclaimed organist and historic keyboardist, liturgical musician, composer, pedagogue, improviser, and conductor. She holds degrees in organ performance and pedagogy, choral music education, an emphasis in music theory, sacred music, and conducting at Dordt College, where she did her undergraduate work, and the University of Iowa, where she did her master's and doctoral work. From 1996 to 2002, she served as a senior researcher at the Göteborg Organ Arts Center in Sweden, as professor of music at Bethany College, Lindsborg, Kansas, and Eastern Michigan University. She's taught organ, harpsichord theory, improvisation, sacred music, and directed the Collegium Musicum. A founding member of Voci dell'Anima, she conducts and collaborates choral and chamber ensembles. She's one of a select, prestigious group of Fleur de Sons classics artists, where her Bach, Teacher, Bohm, and Improvisation and Froberger on the 1658 Desentis harpsichord music is available. Her Bach and Improvisation and Tunder organ works are available on the Loft Gothic label. She has launched many creative works such as liturgical and improvisation events, books such as the acclaimed Bach and the Art of Improvisation Volume 1 and 2, the Muse series, Muse in Peace, Muse at School, Muse for the Soul, Muse at Work, and Improvisation Endeavors. Dr. Pamela, I'm so glad to talk to you today.
It's wonderful to be on your show. Thank you, Nick.
Your book, Bach and the Art of Improvisation, it is truly a wonderful work of research and thoughtful cataloging of the history and the methodology. Perhaps let's start with Bach. And I was watching a few of your interviews, and I was very much taken by the fact that Bach was an improviser. First of all, a lot of people play his works, but many people see him as a composer, first of all, but he was quite the virtuoso, is that right?
Yes, Nick, I wonder often how many of Bach's greatest works were actually dissipated into the air because they were improvised instead of composed. It was during his time when an organist would audition for a church music position or a teaching position, they would be required to have about 90% of the audition as improvisation. And then just 10% of it was
wow.
Yes, isn't that something? And then the other 10% was reading continuo line in order to improvise above it with another soloist, a violinist or flutist. And so that art was so powerful. In fact, there are many scholars today who are beginning to think that the works that Bach and some of his predecessors, such as Böhm and Buxtehude, many of the works that they composed, they actually didn't compose to perform, but as pedagogical works for the students they were teaching how to improvise and how to compose. So they were just documents at that time that were used pedagogically rather than rather than having this idea that these would be performance legacies for them that people would play centuries on.
In your research, what's the cutting edge on Bach research when it comes to his methodology and his style? And what do we know now that's different from 20, 30 years ago?
Related to improvisation, I haven't seen a lot from anybody writing on that because, of course, we don't have the same kind of documentation that we do with the compositions. But Bach also didn't write treatises. He copied part of one treatise for Anna Magdalena, his wife, to teach her some music theory concepts and the basics of how to read Thoroughbass. So I started thinking, Bach's music is timeless, it's ageless, people play it on every possible instrument, and everyone knows Bach's name. I mean, his works are works that every musician is challenged to learn, but that no one gets tired of because they are of such a high quality. Yeah, I really kept this question, well, how did he do that? And what about his music sets him apart in that way? And so I started investigating how he composed and how he taught, because we have some letters and archival material about how he went about teaching different students, and it wasn't just one path. He met the student where they were at.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And then also Robert Marshall is one author who started investigating how Bach composed and whether he composed in layers. And he discovered that Bach must have had a lot of this music in his head before he would start composing, but that if there's any indication of how he composed, he would compose a soprano and a bass first and then fill in the inner voices. Or when he was writing an imitative piece, such as a fugue, he would write the fugue subject and play that subject out as subject and answer in all of the other voices before then continuing with the counter subjects or the harmony that the third or fourth voice would add to a fugue. So we have a few clues.
That's one thing that I think not many people consider when they're learning music, how the composer thought, because we have so much of their music in front of us on beautifully engraved pieces of paper, and we learn them by rote, we memorize them. But I've always wondered, are we really teaching our kids or our music students in conservatories and other places how they came to those notes? And is it fair to say that the 18th and 17th century musician had quite a different skill set that was required back then compared to today?
Oh, yes. They had to be very well versed in theory and composition as it connects to their performance. So I think often today the theory courses are pigeonholed as one track, music history courses as another track, performance as another track, and it's too rare that these topics intersect. But the point of intersection that is the most viable and creates the most vibrant outcome is improvisation.
Yeah, that's true, because to improvise, you need knowledge of the form, you need knowledge of harmony, you need knowledge of melodic construction. Oh, there's so much knowledge that is required before you can even improvise well, I would say. Is that correct to say?
Yes, and I've told my improvisation classes for years that even if you are not aspiring to become a performing improviser, that one would aspire to perform solo improvisations in the midst of repertoire recitals. Even if that's not your goal, you will become a much better repertoire player if you learn to improvise. Because suddenly, rather than just taking a visual, tactile, and aural approach to the music, one begins looking at the music and listening to it and feeling it in the hands, as if, how was this invented? And what other options would have Bach had or another composer had at this moment? And how is this option deemed the best option? And how is that different than how he treats some of the same material later in the piece? And it's asking all of these questions, having a very curious mind and wanting to solve the puzzle of how did this come to be? I mean, it's sort of an archaeology, a musical archaeology of sorts, I guess.
You said something about Bach working with the soprano and the bass lines initially before filling in the rest, so to speak. Now, could you help me explain the difference between Thoroughbass and figured bass?
Yes, it's two terms meaning the same thing.
Okay.
And it refers to a bass line very often given to then a harpsichordist or organist, a keyboard player who would be playing with an ensemble. It could be a trio, as few as 3 members, or it could be a chamber orchestra, or it might even be an entire cantata choir with orchestra. And of course, parchment was at a premium and no photocopy machines existed.
No internet yet.
Exactly. So I think one of the reasons it became so widely used is that it requires very little space, because then the continuo player plays the bass line, the same bass line that a cellist or gambist, or in some cases a double bassist would play, but then has figures just below or above the notes of the bass line, and those figures tell the keyboardists which intervals are in the harmony above each note.
Is the harmony absolutely fixed, or do you have options?
In terms of the intervals, you mean?
If I'm a musician and I'm going to jam with Bach, so to speak, if he gave me a piece of music with Thoroughbass, is the harmony all set, or is there room for a bit of flexibility?
So as most thorough bass lines are intended for ensemble. And in that sense, the harmony is pretty well set, because if the keyboardist suddenly changes the harmony, what the keyboardist plays might clash with what, let's say, the flute or the violin.
Is it fair to say it's kind of like a lead sheet? So it has the harmony there. And
Yes.
If you have a knowledge of harmony, then you know what to play and what will fit and what won't fit.
Yes, but what isn't set is exactly how that harmony plays out. So that the figures give vertical clues, but they don't give linear clues. And Bach wrote, he no matter what kind of style he wrote in, he had this horizontal linear aspect of music, of voice leading, at the forefront of his composition. So the harmony, he was steeped in harmony. His harmony is grand and very accurate, but also profound. But it was never divorced from the linear aspect. And I think one great misconception about thorough bass is that it's just giving a vertical clue. And that's the beginning of the job of a keyboardist. But so much more is possible. So if I'm playing with a trio, I study the parts of the other instruments and find out where can I make beautiful lines that sound similar to the ones that Bach wrote for the other instruments without playing exactly what they're playing.
Now, the study of thorough bass, I believe there was a book by Beethoven, maybe compiled by his students, on the study of thorough bass. And was this absolutely required, that this is knowledge that is necessary to be an improviser?
Yes, I feel like it's critical in the work that I have done, and in the, as you mentioned, extending into the 19th century, it was still alive. It certainly was alive in the 17th century as well. And I think it is the most succinct way of learning sound harmony in any given era. And as I was mentioning before, the other aspect is listening to the other voices that are involved. And I condense the linear part of improvisation with an ensemble to 3 Ds, because this is easy to remember and it's a great way of summarizing what happens. And the first D is dialogue, so that the harpsichord or the organ keyboardist will play in dialogue with the other parts. So sometimes one voice will have a motive and then a rest. And during that rest, the organ or harpsichord player could play something in imitation with that. That's what the dialogue is imitation. The second D is duet. And so this applies frequently to stepwise motion in the other lines. When there's a passage of stepwise motion, it's quite often possible in the keyboard part to play in parallel sixths or thirds with that voice. It sounds lovely, and it is so much more interesting than hearing just vertical chords beneath that wonderful singing line. And then the third aspect is debate, and this is a contrasting part. So for instance, if the soloist or one of the members of the trio has a very active voice, then the keyboardist would be better off playing slower note values. And then the opposite is true when the soloist has long-held notes. Then the keyboardist may add more activity in the line that he or she is improvising. And I give examples of this in my second volume of Bach and the Art of Improvisation, because Bach himself shows us what to do in his sonatas for violin and obbligato keyboard. because he writes out the harpsichord parts for this, and he's doing exactly that, the 3Ds, duet, dialogue, and debate.
By the way, it sounds like you'd be a fantastic teacher. I wish I had you as a kid to teach me. That would be fantastic. Trust me, my music teachers didn't help me with any of this. I kind of had to figure it out. But let's take a thought experiment here. Let's say I was a student in Germany and I went to Bach. I didn't know anything. And let's say Bach took me as a pupil. What would he teach me over the course of a year? What would he make me do?
Right. So we have documents of exactly what the answers to your question, but in each case it might be slightly different. So if you already came with a sound knowledge of harmony and Thoroughbass, he would have you start improvising trios and fugues, perhaps, or rather, that would be the most advanced level for a student. So that would be the ultimate goal. If a student came with no harmony background, he would have that student practice fingering exercises for sometimes months.
And what do we have the fingering exercises that he used?
We have a few of his pieces fingered, again, in the Notebook for Anna Magdalena, and then more particularly in the Klavierbüchlein of Wilhelm Friedemann, which he wrote for his eldest son. And he fingered several pieces there, and his fingering demonstrates different fingering technique. And then we have C.P.E. Bach, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, is another son who became a famous musician, wrote a treatise about the true art of playing keyboard instruments. And in that is included a swath of papers. They were kind of considered as tables and inserted, not right in the rest of the typeset portion of the book, but it's a page after page of fingerings for scales and various figuration passages. And the interesting thing about C.P.E. Bach is that for any given scale, for instance, the C major scale, he has at least 3 alternative fingerings for that scale. So it wasn't standardized to the extent that we find in the late 19th, early 20th century and beyond.
Did Bach ever use the thumb on the black keys like Chopin?
We don't have any examples of that.
Okay, I thought it would be curious to know that.
But also, his normal touch wasn't totally legato. It was considered a singing cantabile touch, but more from the sense of C.P.E. Bach describes it as a string of pearls. And if you study a real string of pearls, each single pearl is of a different shape. And each one, he's talking about how you open up the sound of each individual note when you're playing. But each, on the best made pearl necklaces, the jeweler will sew a knot in between, or tie a knot between each pearl, so that if the strand should ever break, then the owner of the strand of pearls would not lose all of the pearls. They wouldn't all come running to the floor. It would just be one pearl that would fall off. And that image tells us about the kind of articulation that was normal for Bach, in that each note was expected to bloom and to sing, but between each note there was also a tiny little space. And that space is the equivalent of what bowing would sound like on Baroque string instruments, or tonguing on Baroque wind instruments, or consonants in a well articulated, enunciated diction for choral singers.
You mentioned fugues as perhaps the ultimate aim for advanced students, and you mentioned another thing apart from fugues as well. What was the other thing that was for advanced students?
Yes. So after the fingering and the harmony, then he often went with students to the 2-part Inventions. There are several copies of the 2-part Inventions in pupils' hands, in their handwriting, and that shows how frequently Bach was teaching this and having his students copy it to take it home to practice. And so that's teaching both the clean and clear voice leading within individual parts, but then also imitation and how one sets one voice against another. So just baciniums. And then after that, he would have them look at the 3-part sinfonia. And so in a way, it's a type of contrapuntal advance from 2 parts to 3 parts to 4 parts in the fugues.
When we look at the Well-Tempered Clavier, which is perhaps one of the most famous pedagogical texts there are, since you yourself are quite a wonderful improviser, what's the right way to approach a text like that from a creative standpoint? Because you probably, as a musician, look at harmony, you look at texture, you look at motion, movement, whereas perhaps a student might just play the notes and not really think twice about it. How would you take something like that, which is very beautiful and wonderful, and how would you extract musical content from that that would improve you as a creative, improvising musician?
Oh, great question. So what I love to do with the Well-Tempered Clavier is take, first of all, the preludes and study one prelude at a time. And so play the initial C major prelude and then break it down. Oh, I should be by a keyboard so I could play it for your listeners. So if that first prelude has actually 5 chord tones, it's 5 note chords that are repeated, but they're all arpeggiated. And when Bach copied this piece for Wilhelm Friedemann, he started the pattern da da dee da dee da dee da 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 dee da 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 1 2 3 4 5 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5 3 4 5. So you figure out what are each of these voices, how would they work within a chord, and then how do they sound this way in the arpeggiation, and which notes are repeated in the arpeggiation. This is the decoding that I just love about historic improvisation. And then what Bach did after several measures is that he started just writing the 5-note chord because he was running out of parchment. He had a small amount of space, and that would take less room, but the schooled improviser would know then just to continue this 5-note arpeggiated pattern, even though it wasn't written out as the arpeggiated version that he started with. And I think that's a clue for an improviser, that we can take this, then we can turn it back into the 5-note chords, transpose it to other keys. And then what I love to do is to take chorale melodies, because this was chorale melodies were certainly one of the great resources that Bach drew from in his own compositions. In every cantata has a chorale melody involved, at least one, and so many of his organ works are based on chorale melodies. Take a chorale melody and a chorale bass that Bach himself wrote, but then use this prelude material, the design of the prelude, with that new soprano and bass. And so it's taking all of Bach's material, but in a way it's decoding it and then recycling it into a fresh new improvisation that has very firm grounding in how Bach learned how to improvise, because it's taking all of his steps as well as some of his material. And it has astonishingly beautiful outcomes. And this is possible with so many of his Well-Tempered Clavier preludes.
Okay, now you mentioned the preludes. Now, what about the fugues?
The fugues, yeah. So the order in which the fugues and the preludes, for that matter, appear, of course, are by chromatic interval, so C major, C minor, C sharp major, C sharp minor, and so on. But they are not at all in order of pedagogical difficulty. So I would begin with fugues that are 3-voice and dissect them, again, decode what's happening in each voice. How does Bach write his subject? And then how does he write the counter subject? And then which modes or keys, I prefer to call it mode shift, occur within the fugue? Which other key areas does he visit, and why? Why do those work and why do other ones not work as well? to get an idea of the form. But what I do, I mean, looking at one fugue, it tells you about one fugue, and then I would look at umpteen 3-part fugues, and then start with 4-part fugues and 5-part fugues. I also have made a comparative analysis of all of Bach's fugue subjects, and with the subjects, I've been able to determine that he repeats certain ideas. He has just about a dozen different ideas that he uses in different, and they're wearing different clothing each time. I mean, he changes the meter, or he changes the note values, but there's the ascending tetrachord and the descending tetrachord, just 4 notes in stepwise motion that work beautifully for beginning fugue improvisations.
It actually terrifies students who are taking beginning harmony and counterpoint. They can't wrap their head around the idea of even improvising a fugue, but it's possible, right? It's doable.
It is doable, and particularly with a subject that is the stepwise motion, because immediately it's possible to have stretto. So stretto is a hurried or a rushed entrance, then overlapping entrance where another subject will come in before the first subject is complete. So if we just have 1, 2, 3, 4, just 4 notes of a tetrachord, then normally in the first entrances
hold
of
on
that
a second. What's a tetrachord? Is that a tertial kind of chord?
Tetra is 4, so it means 4 notes that are in stepwise motion.
I see.
And if we have these 4 notes, then it's possible in a major scale, the 1, 2, 3, 4 will have the same intervals as the 5, 6, 7, 8. So the imitation comes in with the exact same intervals. When one starts first on the tonic and then answers in the dominant. So that solves a lot of problems for a fugue improviser, because they don't have to worry about creating a real or tonal answer because the intervals already match. And I think that's a wonderful starting point for fugue.
I think most people, when they say, oh, wow, 3 voice, 4 voice, 6 voice, what does that really mean?
Right. For Bach, it meant how many voices enter, first of all, with the subject. And it's typically going to be tonic, dominant for a 4-voice fugue. And then that again for 6-voice fugue, which is extremely rare. And he was very consistent in keeping, once he has 4 voices in a fugue, he will maintain all 4 voices. Handel, on the other hand, a lot of people will know the Amen chorus from the Messiah, enters, which is a descending, or it's ascending tetrachord plus, right? There are 4 notes plus in the Amen chorus. So again, that same stepwise idea. But Handel will often set up each subject and answer in progression, and then certain voices will drop out while another voice picks up the subject, or the voices might start creating homophony, more vertical chords above one of the subject notes, rather than continuing the imitation. And it still sounds very pleasing, of course, but it's not as
intricate, would you be saying?
Exactly, not as intricate and disciplined in a way as what Bach insisted on in his own fugue writing. There's another intermediary step for people who would like to improvise fugues, and that is the Partimento fugue.
I talked to a Dr. Slaminski. He talked about the Italian Partimento. Is that related?
It is. In fact, I think much of this originated in Italy, and Bach, of course, was very eager to study Italian scores. He first copied Italian scores to learn how to compose his own concerti, for instance. And this Partimento tradition traveled to Germany as well, because there were other Germans who used it. But it's particularly strong in Italy, and the whole Palestrina counterpoint then I think coalesced into other schools of Partimento writing. And this is in the case of a fugue, then a composer would write out the subject answer entrances, again, what might be considered the exordium or the beginning part of the fugue. And after that, simply have this thorough bass line that would, in some cases, the bass would carry the fugue subject again at a point, but the bass line harmony itself would tell the improviser where it would work to place that subject above the harmony in other places throughout the rest of the fugue. And they tend to be rather brief fugues. They aren't all that often as lengthy as Bach's most mature fugues. But it's a wonderful way to have some material in front of oneself when learning to improvise a fugue, but without everything else written out. There's still this wonderful puzzle-solving aspect to it.
What was Bach's stature as, well, you could tell me his stature as an improviser and a virtuoso, and also his stature as a composer. Do we have contemporary accounts of this?
Yes, there are more accounts about his improvisation during his lifetime, and that is, people would be astonished, that word came up a lot in the German texts, at his improvisations, and it's particularly related to how he would play continuo, because Bach would turn a trio part. He'd be reading a score that would just have the thorough bass, and then there would be a cellist or gambist playing what the keyboardist plays in the left hand, the bass line, with him. And then he could read then the violin, 2 violins above it, or 2 flutes. And then he would add to this trio a 4th voice. And they described it as just baffling and putting the listeners into this state of wonderment, because he, in his right hand part, would improvise a line that sounded as if it was originally composed with the other 3 lines. And this is one of the huge clues about this linear aspect of his improvisation, that he certainly wasn't treating it simply as vertical chords.
Dr. Pamela, how familiar are you with the 19th century when it goes to Beethoven and Chopin or perhaps even the organ tradition? Because I know you've studied organ improvisation and the history of historical keyboards. How did it change from Bach's time into the 19th century? I think we just stepped over CPE, the Galant style, but I'm just wondering if we could briefly take a walk through history.
Sure. Well, harmony itself, I consider Bach as being extremely pithy or concise in his use of harmony, because his harmonic motion was relatively quick, meaning that he changed harmonies frequently, sometimes every quarter note within a measure. What happened in the Romantic time is that harmony itself was slowed, the harmonic rhythm slowed down, and the harmony frequently didn't change as many times per measure, but was stretched out more over time. The pieces became longer, and then the harmony so that's stretched out in a horizontal way, but it was also stretched out in a vertical way, in that now more and more 7ths were added to the harmony, then 9ths, eventually 11ths, 13th, and then we're also getting into Impressionism, and not to mention jazz, right?
Can you tell me about the great organ players in history? Bach is perhaps the most famous, but who should some people, his contemporaries or perhaps people in the future, who are the great players of the organ? Who are the great improvising virtuosos that people should know?
Yeah, Dietrich Buxtehude, born in 1637, who spent most of his career in Lübeck, Germany, was a composer, obviously at least a generation earlier than Bach, but Bach traveled on foot to be able to learn from Buxtehude, and he very much overstayed his he got permission to leave the Arnstadt Church to go and study his art with Buxtehude, and he was granted permission for a brief visit, and he ended up staying for several months because he was learning so much from Buxtehude. And Buxtehude also, he even composes in quite an improvisatory way. And I think organists know about him, but I think a lot of non-organists aren't so aware of him because he wrote primarily choral music and organ music that was played in the churches. He's a luminary.
How is he different from Bach? If Bach studied from him, how is he different in style and in substance?
Well, one of the fascinating aspects of Buxtehude is that he wrote free works, preludium primarily, but also toccatas occasionally, that were based on ancient Greek principles of rhetoric, because we know that many musicians in Northern Europe were studying rhetoric they had to study Latin, they had to study rhetoric, and they would study music. Sometimes they would study law. These were more the
complete education.
Absolutely. And that rhetoric played a role in the form of the pieces. So there are six main parts to a classic Greek oration. And that was handed down into the rhetoric that was taught in Germany. And so Buxtehude often had these sections in his preludia, and they're more clearly delineated sections. So he would have a free, catchy opening that would hook the listener's ears. It might be virtuosic passage work or some very dramatic rhythm at the beginning, and then alternate that with an imitative, a very studied section, and then back to a free improvisatory section.
How was his harmony back then?
Right, so he was dealing more with the temperaments of pure third tuning, mean tone temperaments, and that on the organ determined what harmonies were possible and which were not, and also even what keys were possible, because the tuning had B flats and E flats, F sharp, C sharp, and G sharp. But the G sharp tuning was far different from an A flat tuning. So A flats were avoided.
It's a completely different world, I feel.
3 sharps and 2 flats were more typical in his time. And that affected what kind of harmony he would write and what kind of mode shifts he might make. Because the organs themselves were so colorful with these temperaments, every single semitone in a chromatic passage had a different distance from each other. And so it's extremely colorful. And therefore, the ears and the instruments, in fact, didn't sound good if one would stray beyond that. But the ears were so enriched already with all of that color of the different spaces in the same interval that it didn't lack for anything.
So his harmony was informed by the instrument, the technology of the time.
Yes, yes.
Now, moving forward to the future, past Bach, I would really love to know about the great organ improvisers that have succeeded in history from that time.
In one of the high times in piano repertoire, you mentioned Chopin and Beethoven, but also Liszt and Brahms were great improvisers themselves. And at that point, the piano had overtaken the organ as the primary keyboard instrument. And because of its dynamic qualities and extended range, and it was, that's where a lot of the improvisation took place in the generations after Bach. But then in the 19th century, a number of French composers emerged, César Franck, for instance. And then after him, there were Vienne and Widor and Tournemire, and then eventually Messiaen.
Just really briefly, these names I do recognize. Maybe we could give a brief description of each one. So perhaps Widor, I think quite a few people know his famous... Yes, that's the one.
The toccata from Symphony No. 5. Well, and what's interesting about this, Nick, is that this pedagogy that I've gleaned from the reports from Bach's pupils about his work works with any pattern language. So, and it works with jazz. It works with messiaen. So let's take the Vidor toccata from Symphony Number 5. So you might have heard it as a wedding recessional, for instance, and it's a toccata, but it's still based on harmony. So it would be completely possible to treat that toccata the same way that I was describing with the Bach Well-Tempered Preludes. Yes, so it has this harmonic basis. We could reduce that to chords and study the harmony throughout. And of course, we've got added sevenths, more ninths, more divergent key areas.
In Western harmony, the knowledge of the figured bass is resilient enough to handle pretty much everything that you could throw at it.
Yes, so jazz symbols are similar. They're not written as figured bass, but we have jazz lead sheets with the chords written above it. So you might have G minor seventh, or you might have A sus, or something like this. That's another code for how to play the from the basic music.
How is it different? Because there are clear differences. Perhaps in an organ, when you see the Thoroughbass, is there a horizontal difference between just like jazz cymbals? Because you get the chords in jazz cymbals, but what are the differences? I guess thinking like an improviser.
Right. I'm studying jazz for the first time this year, and I'm totally loving it. I just heard Chick Corea with the Lincoln Center Jazz Ensemble Saturday 2 days ago, and I'm so inspired. So I'm really fascinated with this question. It's very similar to Thoroughbass because the jazz cymbals indicate the vertical part, the harmony, but not the linear part. So you could take the same jazz line with jazz chord symbols and play it in so many different ways, depending if you want a lyrical setting or if you want to be dancing on the keyboard with arpeggiations up and down.
That leads to my next question, because when a jazz musician looks at a lead sheet, he or she can immediately think of this chord substitutions over a particular chord. Is that the same in figured bass? If you see a set that perhaps you've seen many, many times, can you tell yourself automatically, I can do something different here. I can perhaps change the harmony.
Yes. I mean, again, if you're not playing with an ensemble where it would interrupt their harmony, but sure, there are chords that can be substituted out for each other. Some predominant chords, such as a supertonic chord or the 2 chord and the subdominant chord, share a couple of notes in common, and they can be substituted for each other. Post-dominant chords, such as the 6th submediant chord or the tonic chord, for instance, may substitute for one another. One is more final sounding, the tonic is, and the submediant would be more of a deceptive resolution to something that might lead to another area. And then, of course, secondary dominance may substitute. I mean, if there's a chromatic alteration in one of the scale degrees, if we're in C major and suddenly we have an F sharp, then that can become that sharp 4th scale degree might become a new leading tone to G major. And so we have the subtle shifts. And so those shifts with the chromatic alteration, that happens at a linear level. The substitutions might happen more in the vertical level, the chord substitutions, that way of thinking. But I think it's always important to weave the cloth. So you've got, what do they call it, the warp and woof or whatever in weaving, where you have both aspects, and that's what makes the cloth stronger, that it's woven horizontally and vertically, and that's what we have with harmony too.
I want to ask you about Klaus Bolt and a few of the improvisers of this century, rather the last century, or maybe this century, who are doing stellar work and you yourself, of course, who are doing work, and who are the people we should be looking out for? Because there has been such a wonderful resurgence of classical improvisation. Who are the names that we should be keeping track of? Other than yourself, of course.
Klaus Bolt had a profound influence on me. He was a Dutch improviser who played in Haarlem on this magnificent, huge St. Bavo Kerk organ, Müller organ, and he toured for a while. And I've heard him now on both sides of the Atlantic, but he took classical forms and harmonies, but then added fresh twists to this, and had such inspiring improvisation concerts. For him, very often they were based on Genevan psalms, because those were the pieces sung most in the churches where he served. And but they're timeless pieces of music, because they're Renaissance melodies and harmonies. But he would take the melodies, and a lot of Renaissance tunes have this sort of dance, almost jazzy element to them, of syncopation, what we hear to modern ears as syncopation. And so he would take them and play them in all different styles, Renaissance, Baroque, and then Romantic, and then he'd add 20th century jokes in there. Unfortunately, he didn't live into the 21st century. So yes, he's a wonderful improviser to listen to. Rudolf Lutz in Basel is a wonderful improviser, and I've heard him be able to play in so many different styles as well. And Eduardo Bellotti from Italy, who's at the Eastman School of Music right now, improvises brilliantly in many styles, and also has that capacity for musical jokes, which I think is delightful.
Quotations.
Yes. And then Tom Trenny, who is working near Lincoln, Nebraska, again, mostly in a liturgical setting, but a very creative improviser. And he has also branched into improvising film scores, and is highly creative with the film scores. I think that's quite an art too, being able to work in a multidisciplinary way with sight and sound and genre and era.
I highly encourage everyone to pick up 2 copies for Bach and the Art of Improvisation, Volume 1 and Volume 2. What new things are in Volume 2 that, what are the differences between the 2 volumes?
Yes. In Volume 1, I'm dealing with the fundamental techniques of Thoroughbass and harmony, and then chorales and bass lines, where Bach began his improvisation teaching, adding the inner voices, and then creating variations, partitas, on these chorales and bass lines, and then dance suites, which is essentially taking a partita idea and changing up the meter and the character to fit with an allemande, courant, sarabande, minuet, and gigue. And that's a very brief summary of Volume 1. In Volume 2, I deal more with so-called free works, starting with cadenzas and interludes, and that can be informative to soloists, non-keyboard soloists as well, who are asked to improvise cadenzas in concerti, for instance. And then traverse through preludes and fantasias, and then the art of continuo playing, and culminate with 2 chapters on fugue, first Partimento Fugue, and then taking fugues beyond that first step of the exordium of the fugue into the full-fledged tripartite fugue. It basically has a beginning and a middle section and an end to the fugues that comes again from classical rhetoric of have three portions to a work of art. I'm
going to buy it for my kids in the future. Definitely. I want you to also talk a little bit about your recordings, Bach's Teacher Bomb and Improvisation, and Froberger.
Yes, so I recorded the Froberger on this Roman instrument that was briefly in the United States when I recorded on it, and restored by Keith Hill. It was a Dezentes harpsichord, a fascinating story that Keith thinks might have been refitted for Queen Christina when she abdicated the throne from Sweden and moved to Rome. And she was a huge musical patron. She hired musicians from all over Europe, and she moved to Rome and wanted a harpsichord immediately. And he suspects that she contacted De Zentis, who was the foremost harpsichord builder at that time, to have a harpsichord ready for her when she arrived. And he didn't have enough time to build a new harpsichord, so he reworked one of his harpsichords and then fitted it into a very decorative case that would be fit for a queen, because the original case was more of a lower class case. It wasn't as decorative. So I got to play the works, some of the works of Froberger on that instrument, and it was so interesting because Froberger lived in Rome at the time that this instrument was made, and he was studying with the Italian Roman composer Frescobaldi, and his works show a lot of Italian influence. So that was a wonderful confluence of styles and countries coming together, and very improvisatory free works that Froberger has. So I was attracted to it for that reason as well.
Did you improvise on these albums?
Not on the Froberger one. I did transcribe some of Froberger's pieces from a German tablature, which is a letter notation. As I said earlier, I love puzzles, and this is another coding ways of notating music. But on the Böhm one, I did. So it was within the past 10 to 15 years that it was discovered that Bach indeed studied with Georg Böhm in Lüneburg. And for a while, Bach's sons perpetrated the myth that he had no teacher, that all of this was sort of divinely inspired to
fake news
of amazement of their father, and so they could sell his works for more. But then it was discovered that indeed he had some mentors, and one of them was Georg Böhm. So in my quest to learn how Bach learned, I also wanted to study the works of Böhm.
It's so cool that there are these awesome musicians that people don't know about, but they were really, really. And I'm looking at the Wikipedia for Froberger. He was super famous during his time.
Yes. Yeah, he was well-traveled and cosmopolitan in the influences that he forwarded in his music. So he's a fascinating character. And Böhm in his own right was too, because he had some Italian influence in his works, some French influence, and of course some German influence. And I think Bach absorbed a lot of that. So I took Böhm's works, which are in general a bit easier to access than Bach's for improvising. And I played on the CD, I play a work of Böhm, and then I improvise in that style in
cool.
half of the CD on each of the same types of pieces, but using different musical material. So I'm learning about his style by imitating it, but in a fresh new way. I'm not copying it exactly. I'm just learning from him.
I'm reading here that even Beethoven knew Froberger's work.
Yes.
Are you familiar with Johann Pachelbel's work beyond everybody knows his canon? I was wondering if you had any expertise about his overall work.
Oh, yes. He had a number of students as well, and I use his some of his keyboard toccatas and variation partitas in preparing to teach students how to improvise partitas as well as the toccatas, because he has quite textbook examples of this. He has fewer exceptions to the rules if you wanted to make rules about it. So his pieces are quite easy to decode and to emulate. And so I can highly recommend that. And he obviously had a group of students too, because they together put together this collection called the Weimar Tablatur. And his students are each taking turns at harmonizing chorales and then writing little fugal incipits to the chorales as introductions to chorale singing. And that's a fascinating study for any aspiring improviser.
Man, just imagine getting lessons from like one of these guys. That would be pretty cool.
Yes, and Bach was so desperate to learn about the works of Pachelbel and some other people, contemporaries of Pachelbel, that when he was little, he was orphaned at age 9 and sent to move to live with his older brother.
Wait, Bach was an orphan?
Yes, yes.
Wow.
And he was sent to live with his older brother, Johann Christian, Christoph, who was also a musician. But Bach was a bit more of a prodigy than his older brother, and he wanted to be copying the music of all these people, including Böhm and Froberger and Pachelbel, these people you're mentioning. And his brother forbid him from doing that. And he took these scores that the little Bach wanted to copy, and he locked them up in a cupboard and wouldn't give him the key. But this cabinet had a lattice work front. And so little Johann Sebastian's hands were small enough to work their way through the lattice work. And so he took the score of Pachelbel and some other composers, and he scrolled it up in his hand so that he could make it a small enough scroll to fit through the lattice work, and pulled it out, and then he hid it in his under his bed, and then would pull it out and copy it on full moon and moonlit nights, because he needed the light of the moon so his brother wouldn't see his candlelight. And he copied those scores. That's how desperate he was to learn this music.
Oh, wait a minute. Isn't this was part of his biography, right? And didn't somebody take away that painstakingly written stuff later?
Yes, he finished copying these pieces.
Awful.
Under great duress. And soon thereafter, his brother discovered it and retrieved it all. I just think, why would anyone want to discourage a child? And, now especially we know this is Bach.
Oh, my goodness. Well, Dr. Pamela, let me ask you one final question. Let's end on this. Where would you like to see the education system for classical music change from where it is now? Knowing what you know and all the research that you've done and all the education you've had and all the wonderful performances you've done, how would you like to see the typical classical music education change in the next 10, 20 years?
Oh, what a wonderful question. I started working, Nick, with young children after having taught at the university level for years, because I realized that these separate entities, all of whom were working with music, were not collaborating. They weren't weaving their information together. And with improvisation, I was trying to connect. Let's teach improvisation in music history classes. Let's teach improvisation in music theory classes. Students will understand style much better. They'll understand form. They'll understand the application of the theory. And it's difficult, though, to change an embedded system. I learned that the hard way. And then I started thinking, let's start with children and have them learn improvisation and composition side by side with repertoire, the way that composers used to learn. And in addition to that, let's get their whole bodies and whole minds involved. So let's do singing with movement and various other activities so that music essentially becomes embodied. And then the harmony and the melody and the rhythm, all of that is embodied. And then eventually, with enough study and practice, it can come back out as creative improvisations that they're very good for the soul. They're good for the brain activity that it takes to solve those problems. It gets the right and left hemispheres working together. It builds memory in new ways other than rote memorization. It's a much higher level of memory that's applying great concepts. And I would have them work on some of this outside in nature, so they're experiencing beauty and coming back to music as an art that is to soothe the soul and to calm the mind and the spirit, as the ancient reasons for music and the earliest, even music therapy, let's say, was to soothe troubled minds and bodies. To get back into a holistic approach to music would be the ideal. And I would add, especially in our time, that I think it's really critical for children and adults to learn music of cultures other than our own, to expand beyond the Western canon and start. Right now, I'm taking jazz lessons, and I'm taking Arab music lessons, and I'm learning salsa. I'm trying to learn music from around the world to appreciate the art forms and the intricacies of people from around the world, so that we can come to a language where we can have a civil discourse and find peace and respect for every culture and every community, and approach this instead of with a spirit of suspicion that's all too prevalent today, but with a spirit of wonderment of how do these people learn? How do these people teach? I mean, just this process I've gone through with Bach, that should be the process. I would invite people to take that same process with the people who are our neighbors, right in our geographic location, but our global neighbors as well. What can we learn from cultures from around the world? And we can learn a lot about people through their music, but also by listening to their voices.
Dr. Ruiter-Feenstra, I absolutely applaud your work and your career, and you've done some tremendous things. It was such a treat to have you on the show. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I've really learned a lot, and I'm sure my audience has as well. I'm sure we'd also be absolutely delighted to have you back on again.
I've been composing a lot lately, and we could have another whole conversation about that. And I'd love to learn more about your jazz work and intersections we might find between our work.
Dr. Pamela, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Nick, for your wonderful vision for this show and for your kind invitation today. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.